Language and Disability, a guide to saying the right thing. Why does language change? How can something be the acceptable term at one point and become offensive at another? Some people would have us believe that there is a government office somewhere in Whitehall that does nothing else than decide what people should say. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Statements like this and things like so-called political correctness do nothing but rubbish the notion of equality and should never be used by union representatives. The reality is, language evolves as its usage. Do you remember when gay meant happy? To most now, it means homosexual, but ask a teenager and it means rubbish or out of date. In terms of disability language, even the most clearly offensive, horrible terms can be traced back to previous acceptable language. Crip comes from the term cripple, often used years ago to describe people with mobility impairments, like Tiny Tim here from the Dickens novel. People with Down syndrome used to be referred to as Mongols because of the shape of their face, which was thought to resemble the ancient race. Spaz comes from spastic, the former term for cerebral palsy. It comes from part of the medical name for some forms of this condition. Do you remember these collections? Flid comes from the drug thalidomide given to mums-to-be in the 60s to prevent morning sickness, which turned out to cause limb loss. All of these terms have mutated into negative, offensive terms which have lost the link to specific disabilities completely, becoming generic, derogatory. Here is some guidance on current language, taken from a guide produced by the NUJ. The most important thing to do is to ask the disabled person what they prefer. Use the term disabled rather than handicapped, crippled or invalid. Talk about disabled people, not the disabled or people with disabilities. Refer to people as being non-disabled rather than being able-bodied, healthy or normal. Somebody has learning difficulties, they are not mentally handicapped, retarded or backward. A person is a wheelchair user, they are not wheelchair bound or in a wheelchair. Talk about deaf people rather than the grouping the deaf. Refer to a deaf sign language user rather than deaf and dumb or deaf mute. A person has cerebral palsy, they are not a spastic. A person may have restricted growth or short stature. Don't refer to them as a dwarf or a midget. And don't use the term suffers from, it's not for you to decide. Where a condition has a form that ends in IC, such as diabetic, talk about a person who has diabetes rather than the person who is a diabetic or an epileptic, for example.